A Hidden Life, a 2019 film directed by Terrence Malick, tells the story of Franz Jägerstätter, an Austrian farmer conscripted during World War II who was executed for refusing to swear loyalty to Hitler. Numerous times throughout the film, Franz is questioned about the utility of his conscientious objection.
Your sacrifice would benefit no one.
What good do you think your defiance is doing anyone? You think anyone of it? Ever hear?
Do you imagine that anything you do will change the course of this war?
You are doing no one any good.
In our modern world that is so often ruled by materialist, utilitarian ethics, I think Terrence Malick wants us to wrestle with these same questions. What good does this seemingly futile act accomplish? In light of the bloodshed of this war and this century, why tell this small story at all? Of course, Malick answers these questions in part with a George Eliot quote at the end, which inspired the film's title. Those who live faithfully hidden lives, he contends, are responsible for so much of the growing good in this world. But there's so much more to this beautiful film than this simple sentiment. It's important first to say that telling stories about faithful, holy people that might seem insignificant is nothing new. Particularly in the most deeply rooted traditions of Christianity, those deemed to be saints are revered, celebrated, and even given a place of special authority. Though many of their lives may seem unimportant or hidden by worldly standards, such men and women hold the world together. This isn't mentioned in the film, but Franz Jägerstätter was actually officially beatified by the Catholic Church in 2007. The cardinal presiding over the Mass of his beatification said of Franz that his path in this particular concrete moment in history is a challenging example for Christians to live out their faith with consistency and radical commitment. Telling the stories of saints, or hagiography, has been a common Christian practice, starting with the martyrdom of Saint Stephen in the Acts of the Apostles. Throughout the centuries, stories of martyrs and saints have been painstakingly preserved in order to remind the people of God of the extraordinary significance of these seemingly ordinary people. A Jesuit hagiographical scholar said this of the importance of such stories, calling them truly legendary. Saints are represented for us as what is greatest on earth. Their life is, in truth, the concrete realization of the spirit of the gospel, and from the very fact that it brings home to us this sublime ideal, these legends, like all poetry, can claim a higher degree of truth than history itself. He also compares hagiography to myth, not to imply untruth, but like C.S. Lewis famously used the word, describing larger-than-life stories that make abstract truths concrete and personal. If we view A Hidden Life as mere history, we might be disappointed, as some have been, in its omission of various details. We might be bothered by these utilitarian questions. But if we view Malick's film as belonging to the 2,000-year tradition of Christian hagiography, I think that this comparison of the stories of saints to poetry, myth, and legend can help us to view this film with fresh eyes. If we are attuned to its poetry and some mythological and archetypal patterns, I think we can see its true power and richness. I find that the heart of the first half of the film is its portrayal of what could be called in literary terms the conflict between the individual and the collective. Now, it's easy to think of stories in which characters struggle against oppressive social norms, but I can't think of any recent story, fiction or nonfiction, that treats a character's conflict with his community and society with such an all-encompassing breadth. It's brilliant to me that before Franz's entire world flips upside down, Malick takes time to actually celebrate the beauty and the joys of so many levels of the collective units that account for his identity. His relationships with the natural world and his loving wife Fanny are strikingly beautiful, strengthened of course by Malick's grandiose and transcendent style. And extending from this foundation, their intergenerational family that includes Franz's mother and Fanny's sister is characterized by joy and harmony. They live in a simple but vibrant farming village, populated by a genuine community of neighbors, engaged in fruitful work toiling side by side. They partake in a well-functioning local economy. They engage in purposeful community rituals and celebrations. So many aspects of his culture as a whole seem to be flourishing. And then there's the church, which looms over the village in many shots in the film. Churches in European towns have obviously been central to their communal and ritual life, but their spires, ringing bells, and physical centrality symbolically highlight what the church is truly meant to be. It extends skyward, like the mountain of paradise, representing the good towards which the people of God turn their eyes and orient their lives. In the same way that the bell calls the village to worship, the people of the church, with their identities oriented towards heaven, are meant to live lives that resound with goodness and beauty and love. It's absolutely perfect, then, that Malick highlights Franz's role as the church's sexton. He engages in quiet and unpaid custodial duties, but it is Franz who also rings the bell. Fanny summarizes their state of innocence quite well at the beginning.
It seemed no trouble could reach our valley. We lived above the clouds.
But then, as is the universal story of humanity, cracks begin to appear that shatter this idyllic world. Things begin to flip. The cold presence of the uniformed Nazi soldiers, who find their identity in a corrupted form of collective belonging, disrupt the harmony of the farming community. Language and ideals parroted by Nazi propagandists start to infect the gatherings of the townspeople.
We have to defend our land. Till he came, the people were in despair, humiliated, in chains. You are a traitor.
Neighbor is turned against neighbor. Established bonds of trust descend into spite.
A sin against his family, against his village.
Discord even infects their family, as Franz's mother and Fanny's sister express frustration at his choice. And if we were to picture the church at the pinnacle or center of Franz's hierarchy of collective identity, this corruption reaches, so to speak, to the very top. His local priest and the regional bishop both discourage his actions. Fanny is shunned from their local church after Franz is arrested. One of my favorite lines in the film is when the bishop remarks that the Nazis are melting down the church bells for the making of bullets. What an emblematic picture of this inversion that occurred, as corruption and violence infected every level of German society, from families and neighbors in small towns to the hierarchy of church leaders who were meant to manifest heaven's good and peaceful kingdom. Save for his relationship with his wife and his own dedication to God, Franz's world from top to bottom has flipped upside down.
Is this here the end of the world? Is this the death of the light?
An important turning point occurs when Franz talks to the painter in his church who is restoring a picture of Christ. He says,
Christ's life is a demand. You don't want to be reminded of it. I paint their comfortable Christ with a halo over his head. Someday I'll paint the true Christ.
The implications here are clear. The people of the town and most of Germany have forgotten the life of love and sacrifice to which Christ calls his followers. Franz then becomes, by embodying his Lord, a living representative of that true, uncomfortable Christ that the people were not ready for. This could not be more consistent with the spirit of hagiography. St. Justin Popovich wrote, "The lives of the saints are nothing else but the life of the Lord Christ, repeated in every saint to a greater or lesser degree in this or that form. More precisely, it is the life of the Lord Christ continued through the saints, the life of the incarnate God, the Logos, the God-man, Jesus Christ, who became man." It's also interesting, in view of Franz's standing up alone against a corrupt collective, to think of what Carl Jung said about Christ being a representative archetype of the individual or the self. Jung speaks on a psychological and narrative level of people accepting and manifesting the archetypal Christ as a continued and progressive divine incarnation, integrating us into a kind of divine drama. This, of course, only strengthens the idea that hagiographical stories that parallel the life of Christ are nothing short of legendary and mythological. As the film transitions to following Franz and Fanny as they face the consequences of his public objection, Malick highlights these mythological connections to the story of Christ by making countless allusions, going far beyond the obvious connection of someone who is innocently martyred or the numerous images of crucifixes in the background. Some brief examples include the numerous offers Franz receives to renounce his ideals, accusing him of pride and foolishness. These parallel Christ's temptation in the wilderness. There are numerous scenes of planting and harvesting wheat, which call to mind many of Christ's parables. And then there's the scene when Franz gives his bread to a fellow prisoner, paralleling Christ's feeding of the 5,000, even the Last Supper. In addition, shots of wells in both the village and prison call to mind this important biblical image. At the trial, there are clear connections between the presiding judge and Pontius Pilate in the Gospels as he tries to convince Franz to relent. The camera even focuses on his hands as the sentencing is pronounced. During his imprisonment, Franz is subjected to torture and insults and humiliation. Yet reminiscent of Christ's calls for the Father's forgiveness of his captors, Franz calls the soldiers his brothers. Eventually, as Franz is brought to the site of his execution, he is sat beside two prisoners, like the two thieves crucified with Jesus. One even appears to be hardened, while the other appears to be penitent. And like the crucifixion, his execution is conducted coldly and methodically. Even more, zooming out, Franz, like Christ, faces all his trials with faithful obedience to God and with humility.
When I compare my suffering to that of other people, I see that mine is the smallest of crosses.
When questioned why he thought other Christians did not make the same choice as him, he is noted as simply replying, they did not have the grace. Yet in the same way that Christians believe Christ lived and died as fully human, Franz and Fanny, who is as faithful and humble as him, agonize over the harsh reality to which their submission to God's will leads them. Finally, at the moment of Franz's death, Malick cuts to the bell ringing to the ears of the villagers, calling them, as the lives of Christ and the saints have always done, to repentance and new life. And the film ends with Fanny speaking using imagery of gardens and mountains, echoing the sentiments of true Christian hope that one day what has been lost will be regained. In one of the many tirades against Franz, a fellow prisoner says this, echoing criticisms we've heard time and time again.
He left us, abandoned us, like he did your Christ, his son. How far we are from having our daily bread, how far from being delivered from evil. We had 20 centuries of failure. We need a successful saint.
However, I think if we view Malick's film properly, we have been presented with a picture of what can only be called a successful saint. Listen even to the last line of internal reflection spoken by Franz in the film.
And now, all my dear ones, don't forget me in your prayers. I pray for you from the other side.
Not only has Franz done what countless saints before him did by imitating Christ, presenting us a true model of an individual who stands against the tides of social pressure and cultural collapse, whose holiness and humility are at the same time admirable and convicting to us. But in the eyes of most Christians throughout the last 2 millennia, Franz is currently doing precisely what he says in the film, interceding on our behalf, taking part even now, as he did in his mortal life, in God's work of renewing the world and establishing goodness, justice, and peace.